In this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at ZModeler. ZModeler is a tool set that was introduced with ZBrush 4R7 that allows you to polygon model directly inside of ZBrush. And I mean by that, you're going to have total control over edge extrusion, face extrusions, insets. All your standard polygon modeling tools will be available to you here inside of ZBrush. Here's an example of a model that I created using ZModeler. This is a reproduction of an absinthe fountain that I have in my home. Here is the photo reference on the right side here that's loaded in using Spotlight, and here is the model. This is created entirely from a polygon cube, extruding out and cutting new edges. The glasses as well were created from a separate polygon cube. Now I was able to actually export this to KeyShot and then render, as you can see here. So anything that you can create in ZBrush, you can render in KeyShot, which is something that we have an actual lecture on as well. So if you haven't watched the KeyShot lecture, be sure to do so. So this is composed of multiple pieces too. It's a rather complex object. If I turn off the water reservoir, you can see here we've got the mesh that lays over the filter, and we've got the individual faucets and the nozzles here as well. Now again, this is all created from geometry that was generated directly inside of ZBrush. Previously, this would be a situation where you would have to create a polygon model in an external modeling program like Modo or Maya, then import an OBJ. This opens up the ability to polymodel directly here inside of ZBrush, freeing you from the need to bounce back and forth between multiple programs. So let's take a look now at how we can use the ZModeler toolset to create our own creations. So I'm going to go ahead and reset ZBrush, and let's take a look at these tools now. So to begin, we're just going to select a polymesh star, draw it on the canvas, go into edit mode, and I'll select the basic material too. We're just going to use this as a basic proxy material or proxy model to start with. If we go to the tool menu and scroll down to the bottom of the screen and open up Initialize, you'll notice the Initialize menu is slightly different than what we're accustomed to up to this point using ZBrush primitives. We can now create a Q-cube, Q-sphere, oops, there we go, or Q-cylinder. That's just a quick cube, sphere, or cylinder. You can also see that we can set the resolution in X, Y, and Z for each of those. This just allows us to create a quick polygon basic model, which we can then use. To access the ZModeler tools, we go to B for brush, Z for ZModeler, and just M selects the ZModeler brush. Now as I mouse over areas, you'll notice that the edges and faces light up when you're in this brush. The faces light up with a red square and a red line which extends out from the surface normal. You'll also notice that the faces have an orange line as well. That just tells you the direction of any operations that are directional in their nature. For example, if I'm polygrouping a polyloop, that allows me to define the direction of that loop. If it goes that way, or if the orange line points up and down, the loop goes that way. There you go. Now, when you're mousing over the edges, they become white and light up. Now, whenever you're working in ZModeler, you press the spacebar to access the tools. Now, this is contextual. If I'm over a face, I get the face-specific menu. If I'm over an edge, I get the edge actions. So the way these menus work is the first section are your actions. These are the actions that you can apply to polygons. You can inflate them, insert nanomeshes, insert points, polyloops. You can delete faces. There's any number of things you can do here. Next, you set your target. That's the target which your action will apply to. It can be a single polygon, a polyloop, an entire polygroup. It could be borders. It's any number of different ways you can isolate the target for these actions. Then lastly, we have our modifiers. Usually there's one or two modifier menus here. These are just adjusting the nuances of how these operations take place. When you're on the edge menu, again, you get edge actions and you get targets. So let's take a look at how we can create some interesting shapes using some of these tools in ZModeler. I'm just going to begin by using the transpose tool just to squash this square, this cube down a bit. And let's start by deleting some edges. I'm going to delete the edges running around the middle here. I'm going to mouse over an edge loop, select delete, and make sure my target is edge loop complete. then I can click and delete the edge loop all the way around. Now I'm going to press Ctrl W. That basically polygroups the entire object. Then I'm going to go to Polygroup and select a single poly. Now I can click directly on those polys that I want to polygroup. That polygroup is quite close to the base color, so I'm going to polygroup another couple times with Ctrl W just to get a nice contrast so you can really clearly see where I'm polygrouping. Now you can press Alt and create temporary polygroups like this, but I tend not to do that. I tend to just create my polygroups directly with the polygroup menu. Now if I go to QMesh, I can set my target to polygroup all and click and drag, and it will drag these out. I can now go to Scale, polygroup all, and I can scale these, and it's scaling around the center axis at this point. So if I go to my menu here and I can select under Modifiers, Polygon Center, I can now scale like this. Now we can go to Transpose, Polygroup All. We can click these endpoints and then just use the Transpose tools to bring these down. Now I would like to actually cut a circular hole in the center here. To do that, I'm going to mask the center portion, the center point here. Then I'm going to go to the Brush menu, C for Clip, and use the Clip Circle Center brush. I'm going to clip the center just like this, holding the Alt key down, and you'll see that it actually reorganizes those points in a circular pattern. I'm going to clear my polygroups with Ctrl W, and then I'm just going to go ahead and create new polygroups for the front and the back here. Now I will go to QMesh, make sure my target is polygroup all, and I will push those in until they go all the way through and punch a hole. Punching negative spaces in ZBrush is now so much easier than it used to be. That was a big problem before, was it was actually quite difficult anytime that you wanted to make a negative space. So I'm just polygrouping the fronts and backs of these pieces again. And let's go ahead and select Inset, Polygroup All. And it's defaulting to individual faces. So I'm going to undo that and set my target, or my modifier, to be Inset Region, so it does the entire region here. Here we go. Go to QMesh, Polygroup All, and now I can punch another hole right through there. Now, if I were to take QMesh and do a single poly, I can take this face, and look, as I drag it across, it's smart enough to automatically merge with the underlying faces. So basically, I can take this face, and as I pull it out, it'll automatically snap and weld itself to the other polygons. So that's quite an interesting approach there. It's not something that I want to use on this shape, but I just want to show you that QMesh is smart enough to do that. I'm going to do some edge operations now. I'm going to go to the edge and select Bevel, and I'm going to make it, let's do Edge Loop Complete. Let's bevel this edge, bevel this edge, bevel this edge, and bevel this edge. And now I'm going to polygroup these individual faces. And we'll use QMesh, use QMesh, polygroup all, and let's bring these out. We'll scale them. There we are. Perfect. So we've started to create a very complicated, very interesting shape here just by extruding faces and edges and carving out holes. Let's take a look at how we'll smooth this shape now. If we go to Geometry and click Divide, we'll get a single subdivision level, like so. Twice gives us 2. Now, The drawback to this is if you start subdividing your model, you cannot use the insert mesh brushes or nano mesh or any number of other tools in ZBrush that require a single subdivision level. That's why Pixelogic has built in dynamic subdivision levels now. If you turn on dynamic subdivisions, it's the exact same as having any number of subdivisions defined by this slider here. However, for ZBrush's toolset, as far as it's concerned, there are no divisions on here. So you can use nanomesh, you can use insert mesh. These things are available to you. So you're also going to have access here to these points, and these are really handy, and they're probably quite recognizable to anyone who's done subdivision modeling before. These just represent the points of the mesh. If I were to push and pull these around, I can drastically change the shape of the model while I'm in smooth mode. If I turn off my smooth preview with Shift D, you can see those correspond to the points of the mesh. Now there's a few ways that we can treat this. If I turn QGrid up to 1, I can actually, turn that up to 1, there we go. I can smooth without using the smooth modifier. This is the same as if I had brought a cube in. If we go back to initialize and create a new cube. If I had brought a cube into ZBrush, gone to the geometry menu and turned off SMT, divided it, and then turned SMT back on, do you see how we maintain the volume of our cube? It is far different than when you bring a cube in and just start dividing it with SMT turned on. That shrinks the mesh. So typically when you're bringing in an object into ZBrush that you want to use for hard surface modeling, like maybe a sword or some armor, you'll turn SMT off before you start dividing. That allows you to get subdivision levels without smoothing out your volume, without losing your actual shape. So here, if we turn QGrid onto 1 and turn up our flat subdivision levels, we can actually get the same effect. If we turn on bevel, we can bevel our edges using the coverage slider to control that. If we turn on chamfer, we can chamfer the edges using the same coverage slider as a controller. My personal preference is generally to use QGrid at 0 and treat this like subdivision levels. However, there are times when I'm working on perhaps a sword or some armor where I will use the QGrid. The smooth subdivision slider here, that just gives you the number of subdivision levels. When you're done with everything and you want to turn it into actual subdivisions, click Apply and that will bake them down. It'll crease any edges that are necessary and then give you the number of subdivisions that you have set. We had it set to 2 levels, so that's level 1 plus 2 divisions, giving us 3 subdivision levels. So while we're in smooth mode, we can actually do some creasing here. If I select an edge and then go to the Edge menu and select Crease, we can crease Edge Loop Complete here, and let's do some creasing. I'll go ahead and select this edge right here. And that's not actually very clear, that's hard to see. Let's move down here. If I select this edge here and click, you see that it's creased that whole edge along the top. If I do it again along these holes here, you can see that we can get a nice creasing just along these holes. If you find that it's difficult for you to select an edge, just simply turn off your preview with Shift D. Creased edges have a double dotted line on them. If you zoom in, you can see there's a double dotted line there. That's just a visual cue to show you you have a creased edge. If you want to uncrease, just Alt-click an edge and it will uncrease. There we go. If I crease that whole bottom edge, it'll flatten that straight down to the base. I'm going to polygroup this, 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 and this. And let's go ahead and inset, polygroup all. Make sure that we have it set to inset each poly individually. There we go. And let's go ahead and use extrude. Oops, we've got an extra polygroup there, so I'm going to undo that. And I'm going to polygroup single poly. Watch this. If I click this and then press Shift, I can sample this polygroup. And then I'll click that face, and that applies that polygroup to that face. So now we'll go back to Inset, Polygroup All, and let's inset these faces. We'll go to QMesh and extrude them out. Now let's say that I want to cut an extra edge loop in here. I'll just select the edge and click Insert, and I can click and insert new edge loops in here, and that's going to sharpen those edges. I'll go back to QMesh, single poly. If I QMesh and bring that across, look what happens. It automatically snaps and connects to the next mesh that's closest to it. There you go. You can do the same here. I'll just grab that, stretch it across, and you can see that it starts to snap, connect to these points. By the way, if you've got an extrusion here that you want to get rid of, simply select it and start extruding it back. And QMesh is smart enough to take that extrusion and then flatten it back down. So let's go back to this edge here, and let's crease it. Let's crease this inner edge right there. And let's do the bottom one as well. Again, here that you can see where it's actually a little tricky to get that edge, just Shift D, and then we can click and turn it back on. There we go. So let's say I want to add a different part here. I will go to the Subtool menu and Append, bring in a poly star, select that star, and then go down to the Initialize menu and just create a cylinder along Y. And perhaps I want to increase, oops, set that to a couple different ones there. There we go. Now I'm going to use the transpose scale to scale this down so it sits right there inside that negative space real nicely. And then we'll just go ahead and move this up. I'm going to go ahead and save my work. So we'll just take QMesh, single poly, change the single poly to flat island, and that'll grab all the faces in this flat island and pull them forward. Bring that out, and let's do a couple more extrusions here. Okay, now I'm going to polygroup everything with Control W, go to Polygroup, Polyloop, and let's polyloop this, and then QMesh this out. Oops. Polygroup All. There we go. We'll bring that out. And let's do the same up here. Let's polyloop. And let's bring this out. Now I'm going to polygroup this point. Oops, we've got to do single polys. This face, this face, this face, this face, this face. We're alternating, going around. This face, this face, this face. By the way, if you only get part of a face, you can see ZBrush draws the dotted line of the rest of the face and makes it a lot easier to select portions that you can't actually see. So watch this. If I go to QMesh, select Polygroup All, and grab these yellow faces, if I start to pull them back, as they get to the next group of faces, they will snap to. Now, if I were to inset these faces, if I go to Inset, make sure it's set to Inset Each Poly. We inset these down, and now go to QMesh, bring this out. They will snap larger to fit the associated face. Now I'm going to go ahead and Control W to polygroup everything again, and let's just do a single polygroup here. Let's group the outer faces. Things like this are so much faster to do using the ZModeler brushes than they would be to do in Maya or Max directly. Here you go. You can see how easy it is to sort of grab these back faces here. That should be everyone. Yes. So now we will do Inset, Polygroup All, and now we will go to Q-Mesh and just punch holes right through there. So that gives us more real nice negative spacing there. So let's go ahead and polygroup a polyloop here. I'm going to group all and then polygroup that. We'll do Q-Mesh. Now you can do polygroup border here, so if I were to do this, I can actually create a border there and only work on the border. As you can see, instead of just grabbing that centerpiece and extruding it, it generates a border. So if we were to go to extrude, for example, polygroup border, there we go, polyloop, and I'm just going to bring that back like so. So now what I want to do is I want to create some bridges. I want to delete a hole here and delete a hole here and then bridge between the two shapes. So ZBrush, ZModeler here, has some bridging tools which are actually really powerful and quite cool. So just as an example, let's go ahead and see about deleting this face here. I'm going to go to Delete, and I'm going to delete this face and this face. Now I'm going to go to my edge selection, and it can be hard in this mode, as you can see, to sort of select the right edge. So Shift D to step out of that selection mode, go to Edge and select Bridge. And we're going to bridge two holes. Select one edge, select the next edge, and here you see it connects. If I drag my mouse cursor to the left, it will add curvature. Drag it to the right, it adds curvature. Drag it up, it adds geometry. So there you go. You can see that we can create a really nice connectivity between those two shapes. So here, let's do another one. Let's go ahead and delete a face. Let's grab one edge here and grab another edge. Now there are other options here. You could do arcs, for example, and grab one hole and the next hole, and then turn up and then move left and right. There you go. Moving left and right changes the curvature. Moving up and down adds geometry. There we are. I'm going to redo that one. There we go. I got just a little too far out there. There we go. That's much better. So you can see how it creates this really nice sweeping arc going from one hole to the next. We can do these straight as well. So if I click a hole here, it's not as interesting, but we can quite easily grab an edge here and grab an edge here. Edge, edge, and then increase the number of divisions. edge, edge. There we are. Now I'm going to go ahead and Control W just to clear the poly grouping. And polygroup, single poly. And let's go ahead and polygroup this shape in here so we can actually create sort of a recessed area at the top of this barrel. We'll go ahead and do QMesh, polygroup all, and inset that. There we go, and that creates nice depth there into that barrel. Now if I select this edge and click Insert, I can insert an edge loop here and then scale that edge loop. If I have just the single edge selected, I'm only going to select that edge and move it, or and scale it. But if I select Edge Loop Complete, I can actually scale down that entire edge loop, creating a nice hourglass shape there. Control W will clear out those poly groups. Now what I like to do is come in here and go to poly loop group by poly loop, and let's create some poly groups running in a loop around this way. Do it to both of these. And go ahead and select QMesh, polygroup all. And let's go ahead and click and drag to offset these and create this nice ribbed surface, sort of like the knurling that you get along the length of some conduit. Very cool. So we'll go ahead and delete this face here and do another bridging from here to here. Go ahead and select edges, bridge, edge 1, and select edge 2. There we go. Now we've got our connectivity between both. And of course we can go in and get rid of any sort of edge loops that we don't need. Just click delete, edge loop complete, and we can delete that edge loop, and then just scale this edge loop down. And we'll do the same thing here. Select our edges and go to delete, get rid of this edge loop, and then go to scale, and then scale this edge loop down. So it's very easy to take ZModeler and create really interesting dynamic shapes just by poly modeling techniques. Something that I often like to do is take objects like this and then duplicate them and then rotate them around an axis. In this case, I'll rotate it around the y-axis and then scale it down. It just allows me to combine objects like this into even further complicated forms. There we go. Take this one, and then let's scale that down. And then we can take that one piece and countersink it into the barrel itself. So you can see very quickly you can take simple objects, duplicate, and transform them, and add even more complexity to your object. Oops, there we go, and let's duplicate this one as well. If you click this white circle here, it will snap to the center of the object and make it a lot easier to work with your transformations. There we go. Now, because we're using dynamic subdivision levels here, we're able to use our insert meshes. So I'll actually turn up my smooth to 3 so we get a bit of a smoother look to the model. Turn on my X symmetry so you can see that we're working on both sides of the model here. And if I wanted to, I could go to transform and actually turn on radial symmetry. And you'll notice that if I go in here to my transform menu and adjust there we go. I can create a ring of bolts just right here. I'll just go to B for brush, I for insert, go to our industrial parts, go to the meshes and grab a bolt head, and just click and drag, and now we've just added a ring of bolts right there. If we go to transpose move, it's going to already be locked to the right axis, so I could countersink those down. This is not something that you could do if you actually had subdivision levels on this mesh. So go to our models here. Let's go to B for brush, I for insert, go to our machine parts, and select the meshes, and let's find something interesting to place in here, like an LED light. And again, we can just radially place these, just like so. Press the W key. Our transpose line is already locked to the right axis, so we can countersink them down into the surface of the model, and then clear our mask. There we are. Press the W key, countersink. I personally really like this model of this dial. I find it particularly interesting for creating really cool shapes. Go to transpose, lock it that way. Go to rotate, and we can actually change the angle. We can bend them down like that. So that completes this look at ZModeler. We've seen how you can use the Q meshes and ZModeler together to create very complex geometry using standard polygon modeling techniques, which are now available inside of ZBrush. So hopefully you can take these lessons and go forward and find ways to use ZModeler in your own workflow. It's basically opening up an entirely new tool set, typically that you had to leave ZBrush for before, has now been brought directly inside the program. So hopefully you enjoy working with ZModeler, and now let's move on to the next lecture.